Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 1. Jim. He was an inch or two under 6 feet tall and powerfully built. His voice was deep and loud, and he was always very well dressed. He worked in the ports of the Far East. He was known as Jim, just Jim. He had another name, but he was afraid of anyone knowing it, because he wanted to hide a fact, and when the fact was known, he would suddenly leave port. He was travelling slowly but surely towards the rising sun. Afterwards, when he finally decided to leave the ports behind him, the Malays of the jungle village he came to live in added another word to his name. They called him Tuan Jim, or Lord Jim. Jim had always wanted to be a sailor, and after 2 years of training he went to sea. He had dreamed of the sea, and the adventures it would bring all his life. So when he finally entered the regions so well known to his imagination, he found them strangely empty of excitement. However, he worked hard, was gentlemanly, and had a thorough knowledge of his duties. In time, when still very young, he became chief mate of a fine ship. On this ship, Jim had his first piece of bad luck. He was badly injured during a storm when one of the ship's sails fell on him. His Scottish captain would say afterwards, "Man, it was a perfect miracle how he survived it." Jim's injuries continued, and when the ship arrived at the next port, Jim was left behind. In this eastern city, Jim met many new characters, generally of two kinds. Some, very few, lived energetic lives, full of dreams, dangers, hopes and plans. However, most were lazy, and they hated the horror of hard work. They loved short voyages and the difference of being white. They led easy lives. At first, this gossiping crowd seemed to be nothing more than shadows, but after a time Jim became fascinated with them and their lives of leisure. So he gave up the idea of going back to England and took the job of chief mate on a ship called the Patterson. The ship was to carry 800 pilgrims to a port in the Red Sea. The captain of this ship was a German who had no love for his home country. He was enormously fat and looked like a baby elephant who had been trained to walk on his back legs. A month or so later, Jim was in court trying to explain what had happened on the Patterson. This was when we first looked at each other, and I still remember Jim's story quite clearly. Everybody was there in that courtroom, as it was such a notorious story. There had been 4 of them who escaped from the ship. The captain, as soon as he realized the seriousness of his actions, had run away immediately, saying in broken English, "Bah, the Pacific is big, my friend. I know where there is plenty of room for me. I will an American citizen become." One of the others, an older man with a long grey moustache, had drunk himself into insanity. It is said that he had been drinking 4 bottles a day of the most evil rum. Jim was the only one of the 4 who was able and willing to stand trial, and when our eyes first met in court, he gave me a dark, unfriendly stare. I was very interested to find out his story. What had this clean, honest young man been doing? Why had he escaped with his crew members when they seemed no better than criminals? That had been the second day of the trial. This was when I had my first meeting with Jim. I was walking out of the court with my friend, and we had just gone past Jim. At that moment, my companion nearly fell over a little yellow dog that had been wandering about between people's legs. "Look at that miserable dog," said my friend. "Did you speak to me?" asked Jim, directing the question to me. "No," I replied. "You say you didn't, but I heard you. And what did you mean by staring at me all this morning during the trial? I won't let any man call me names outside this court. Even if you were the size of 2 men and as strong as 6, I would tell you what I thought of you," he said. "Please stop and tell me what I called you," I replied. "Now you see I'm not afraid. You try and crawl out of it. Who is the miserable dog now, hey?" he asked me. I directed my finger towards the little animal by the entrance of the court. He looked confused at first, then amazed, as if the dog was some kind of monster. "Nobody was trying to insult you," I said. He turned a bright shade of red, and hurriedly walked away. I decided to go after him and asked him why he was running away. "Never! Not from any man on earth." He paused and then continued more calmly, "I'm sorry, it was my mistake. I don't mind people staring in court, but not outside." I was very curious about this man, and so invited him to have dinner with me. We met that evening at the hotel I was staying at. The restaurant was busy with many kinds of people, lone individuals, married couples, small parties, and large noisy ones. Jim was quiet at first, but a little wine relaxed him. "This court business must be very hard for you." "It is hell." And so he told me his story. The ship had hit some hidden underwater object. It must have been another ship which had been lost, but hadn't sunk to the bottom of the sea. I went to the bottom of the boat to inspect the hull, and I tell you honestly, it was bending under the weight of the sea. I was certain the ship would sink at any moment, and I would be drowned. I looked at the passengers sleeping and thought to myself, they are already dead. They were dead. Nothing could save them. There weren't enough boats, and there wasn't enough time. No time. Where would the compassion be in making all those people terrified when I couldn't save them on my own? The other crew members were all grouped around one of the lifeboats, trying to get it into the water. I wouldn't help. How could I? How could I save myself and leave all those other people to die? "Coward," the captain called me. "Coward." He laughed bitterly. Chapter 2. The Jump. I stood and looked out at the sea. A storm was coming towards the ship. It had already eaten up 1/3 of the sky. The other men had given me up and were trying to get one of the lifeboats into the water. The boat was heavy and they were pushing for their lives. As soon as the boat started to move, one of the men would jump into it, then it would fall back to where it started. This happened 3 times. Oh, how I hated them. Then I saw one of the men fall backwards, holding his chest. He had a weak heart, and all the hard work and excitement had given him a heart attack. Ha! If only he had stood still. If he had only told them to go to hell. If he had only stood with his hands in his pockets, he would still be alive. But the other men were so busy they didn't notice what had happened. Eventually they got into the boat, into the water, and then they waited for the other man. "George," they shouted at the ship, "jump, we'll catch you." As Jim was telling me this, he paused for some time, looking at his hands. Then he said quickly, "I jumped." I could see that he was clearly ashamed of his action. I knew nothing about it until I looked up and saw the ship towering over me. It was higher than a wall. "I wished I could die," he cried. There was no going back. It was like jumping into a deep bottomless hole. It terrified me to see the ship still there. I wanted it to sink, wanted the suffering to be finished. I hated the thought that the drowning wasn't over yet. Nobody in the lifeboat made a sound for a long time. Finally somebody said, "She's gone." They all looked where the ship should have been. There were no lights. All was black. After a while they started to talk. I could hear them, but said nothing. They all agreed they'd had a lucky escape. I stayed silent. Eventually I heard my shipmate speaking to me. "What stopped you from jumping, you lunatic?" Then another said, "George, what have you got to say for yourself?" One of them walked over to me and took a closer look. "It's the shipmate." "What?" shouted the captain. "No," another man screamed. It became clear they thought I was responsible for George not being there. They called me horrible names. I could hear hate in their voices. It made them mad to think I had escaped with them. They were like a group of little dogs. Yap, yap. But it kept me alive, I tell you. It saved my life. Sitting there in my thin cotton uniform on that night, I'll never be so cold again in my whole life. The engineer stood up and called me a murdering coward. Then he shouted, "You killed him! You killed him!" I shouted back, "No, but I'll kill you if you're not quiet." I jumped up at him, and he fell backwards and hit the boat with a thump. The captain started to come at me. I noticed him in the dark, a big man. "Come on," I shouted. He stopped and went back to where he was. "You had a lively time in that boat," I said. I was ready for anything. On that boat there was no fear, no law, no sounds, not even eyes. Well, not until sunrise. "Well, then what happened?" I asked. "Nothing. They only wanted noise. I sat there, awake and waiting in the dark for 6 hours, already ready and alert with a heavy piece of wood in my hand. When the sun rose, I could finally see them. They sat opposite me like 3 dirty owls, staring at me. But in the morning, everything was different. Now they were friendly, wanted to make up a story with me, to explain why we had left the Patna and not tried to help the passengers. I ignored them. They spoke quietly to each other about what to do when we were rescued. The day continued, and I sat in that small boat. The sun travelled from east to west, burning my head. Normally it would have driven a man mad, but on that day I was thinking as clearly as any man ever has. The Avondale picked us up just before sunset. My shipmates told their story. The ship had gone down in the storm, sank like a stone, they said. "You said nothing?" I asked him. What could I say? But it felt like cheating the dead. Of course, everything changed when we arrived at port. A French gunboat had picked up the Patna and successfully taken it to safety. There was to be an investigation into why the officers had left the ship. I told Jim I could help him escape. There was no need for him to go to the trial the next day. I could lend him some money, help him find a job somewhere else. The money was ready in my pocket. He could leave now, but he wouldn't listen. "You don't understand," he said. "I may have jumped from that ship, but I don't run away." For a few seconds we sat in silence. "I would very much like to see you after the—" "I don't see what will stop you. This damn business won't make me invisible. No such luck." And so we left each other that night. I felt very sorry for him. He was a man of less than 24 years, and he had lost all hope for the future. The verdict of the trial was read the next day. Abandoning in the moment of danger the lives of the passengers and the possessions of the owners, therefore, Gustav so-and-so, native of Germany, certificates cancelled. The court was silent. Jim left the court with his head lowered. I found him later, standing looking out at the sea. I told him he could stay in my apartment for a few days while he decided what to do. He followed me without saying a word. That evening we sat in silence in my room, me at my desk writing endless letters, leaving Jim to his thoughts. Jim stayed with me for 2 days, but on the third he wanted to leave. I knew I couldn't abandon him to the darkness. I would never forgive myself. I wrote a letter to a good friend of mine, telling him that Jim was to be helped in any way possible. The next day Jim and I parted, and this was the last I heard of him for 6 months. I received a letter from my friend, telling me about what a fine fellow Jim was. I was pleased to hear Jim was doing so well. Soon after this, I made a trip, and on my return another letter was waiting for me. This time the news wasn't so good. "There is no silver missing, but he is gone, leaving on the breakfast table a little note of apology. I regret very much his leaving. He was much liked and will be missed." I put the letter to one side and looked through my others until I found one in Jim's handwriting. I opened it and read his story. It seems one of the crew from the Patna had arrived in his town and was looking for work. "I couldn't stand his friendliness," Jim wrote to me, "from 700 miles south of the seaport where he had been living. I knew he liked me. He thought I was an excellent fellow. Pah! When I remember how he had spoken to me on that little boat, it made me feel sick." Jim's story seemed to follow him wherever he went, and each time it arrived at the port where he was living, he would leave and go to another place. He did this more times than I can count on the fingers of my 2 hands, all this to escape his personal ghost. Of course, the funniest thing was that after a time, because of his sudden departures, he became quite well known in the eastern ports of Asia. Chapter 3. Jim and Patterson. We met again in Bangkok, and we left town together the next day on my ship. Some weeks after this, we arrived at a port where a good friend of mine, Stein, lived. That evening I decided to ask his advice about Jim. Stein was a wealthy and respected businessman who dealt in buying and selling a great deal of rare butterflies. He was also one of the most trustworthy men I had ever known. He saw the solution to our problem at once. "My trading post, in Patterson," he said. "My man there, Cornelius, needs to be replaced. He's no good, and I think he's been stealing from me. I don't think he would leave, as he has a daughter there, but I could let him keep his house and start Jim in a new place." I should explain that Patterson is a native-ruled state, populated mainly with Malaysian, with a main town 40 miles from the sea, in the middle of a forest, with 2 large hills overlooking it. 3 days after our conversation, Jim started on his journey there. He was given a small silver ring by Stein, with the instructions to find a chief called Doramin. His last words to me before he left were, "I promise to look after myself." Jim arrived at a small fishing village called Batu Kring, from where he asked his way to Patterson. On arrival, Jim soon discovered that there were 3 powers there. The first he met was the Raja, a dishonest ruler who was immediately scared of Jim and had him put in prison. Jim escaped quickly, jumping over the walls of his jail and then swimming a river to safety. On arrival at the next village, he had just enough breath in his body to say, "Doramin, Doramin." They carried him off to their leader. Jim showed him the ring given to him by Stein and was allowed into the heart of the community. Doramin, a huge fat man, was the leader of the Bugis, a race of intelligent and courageous men. They were opposed to the Raja, who used his power badly to steal from the poor. Doramin had a son, Dane Warris, who he was very proud of. He was about 25 years old and respectful to his parents. He and Jim soon became great friends. The third power in Patterson was a fanatic Muslim bandit called Sheriff Ali. He terrorized the population of Patterson from his fort on top of one of the hills. The Bugis were very afraid of their 2 neighbors, but Jim realized soon after his arrival that he had the power to make peace. It was Dane Warris who was the first to believe in his plan, and with his help, Jim was able to convince Doramin that the sheriff should be attacked. It was during my only visit to Patterson, when we were standing on one of the hills overlooking the city, that Jim told me all about the attack. "It all started here," Jim told me. On the other hill, the remains of Sheriff Ali's fort could still be seen. He had taken 2 of Doramin's small cannons and put them on top of the hill. "Getting them here was the difficult thing," he said. On the night of the action, Jim had been rushing up and down the hill like a squirrel, directing, helping, and watching. Old Doramin had himself carried up to the top of the hill so he could watch the attack. But Sheriff must have thought we were mad, because he didn't come to see what we were doing. When the cannons were in place, Jim left the responsibility of firing them to 2 old Bugis men, and then he went to join Dane Warris to lead the attack. As soon as the first rays of sunshine could be seen, the cannons were fired. The top of one hill was covered in smoke, and from the other came the noise of shouts and screams. Jim and Dane Warris were the first to get to the fort and force their way past the gates. The third man in was Tam Itam, Jim's own servant. There was a hot 5 minutes of fighting before somebody set the fort on fire and everyone had to escape. That was the last we saw of Sheriff Ali. After that, the excitement in Patterson was very great. "You must have enjoyed it," I replied. "It was amazing." After this, Jim became very famous, and he was the most powerful man in the area. And so I should also mention the other thing I found out about Jim during my visit, and that was his love. Jim called her Jewel. She had skin the colour of olives, was both shy and confident. She would often just sit and listen to us talk, her big clear eyes watching our mouths. Her mother, a half Dutch, half Malaysian, had taught her to read and write, and she had learnt English from Jim. They had soon met after Jim's arrival. He had left the safety of Doramin's house and gone to live with Cornelius, a miserable old man, and the stepfather of Jewel, who was Mr. Stein's representative before Jim arrived. Jim was not safe living there, because Sheriff Ali wanted him dead, but he sympathized with Jewel and did not want to leave her alone with Cornelius. Eventually there was an attempt to kill Jim. He told me how he was woken up one night by Jewel. Get up, she told me. I jumped to my feet and she gave me my revolver. She asked, "Can you face 4 men with this?" I laughed and said, "Yes, of course. Command me." "They are waiting in one of the buildings." She led me to the house where the men were waiting. I walked into the main room but could see no one. "Fire! Defend yourself!" Jewel cried. "There's nobody here," I replied, and then I saw a pair of eyes. "Come out," I ordered. The man jumped out and ran towards me holding a sword. I raised my arm, aimed and fired. The man's head flew backwards and fell to the floor. I only realized later that I had shot him through the mouth. I stepped over the dead body and pointed the gun at another man, but just as I was about to fire, the man threw down his sword and stood up. "How many more of you?" "2 more, Tuan." The other 2 came out, their hands empty. I walked them away towards the river. Finally I stopped and told them, "Give my greetings to Sheriff Ali until I come myself. Now jump." The 3 men jumped into the river with a splash. I decided after this that action must be taken against Sheriff. The event had brought the 2 of them closer. Jewel had saved Jim's life, and afterwards Jim told her he would never leave her. But when I met her on that short trip, she seemed to be worried about something. Her mother had also fallen in love with a white man, and before she died, she had, with tears in her eyes, warned Jewel to be careful, that the white men would always return to their own world. One evening when I was alone with Jewel, and she told me, "I don't want to cry dying. Why have you come here? Do you want him?" "Don't worry, I don't want him. No one wants him. I shall go tomorrow, and that is the end. The world you don't know about is too big to miss him. Do you understand? It's too big. You've got his heart in your hand. You must know that." "Yes, I know that, but why does nobody want him?" "You want to know?" "Yes," she cried. "Because he is not good enough," I said. "That is the same thing he said. You lie!" She started to cry, and I realized it was no use trying to explain. I heard somebody coming towards us, so I left her alone. The night was beautiful, and I found a quiet, peaceful place by the river to stand and think. The moon shone through a gap in the trees. It felt strange to be leaving my friend behind, but I had decided that I should never come back here. The silence was broken by Cornelius, who came over to me like a rat and began asking me all sorts of questions. We started to talk about Jewel, and it became clear that he saw her as a possession of his, and so if Jim was to be allowed to marry the girl, Cornelius should be given some money in return. "When Jim leaves, I can look after her for a small present." "That time will not come," I told him, "because Jim is not going to be leaving. He will never go home." "Ha ha ha," she laughed. "We shall see, we shall see. Steal from me? She is like her mother, a devil." I walked away from the disgusting little man. As I left, I heard him say, "No more than a child, a stupid fool." The next day, as Jim and I were sailing down the river, leaving Patterson behind me, I had completely forgotten about Cornelius's bitterness. The place was like a picture, which I could look at for a time, leave, and then on my return it would be the same. I was turning away from the picture, and was going back to the other world where things change. But I could not imagine any changes to this place. The enormous Doramin with his dreams for his son, Dane Warris, intelligent, friendly and brave, absolutely faithful to Jim. The girl, totally hypnotized by her love of Jim, and miserable, pathetic Cornelius. They were like statues, unmoving. But the man who they revolved around was more difficult to see as a statue. He would be living, changing, working or fighting. He was one of us.